Welcome to COVID and Climate Change Correlations, a weekly video podcast where I, Daniel Sanderson, engage in a stimulating conversation with post-Keynesian economist Steve Keen. Okay, well, we're going to welcome everybody back to another episode of the Steve Keen Show. Do you think we should change that name to the Steve Keen Show or stay with our COVID and climate correlations, right?
Maybe give it a try for 1 week and see what happens to the number of views.
Yeah, that's right. Well, we're still on the pathway of doing a whole bunch of clips, but Scott Heftler is back in studio and Steve is the star of the show. So, guys, I wanted to start off with playing with the imagination just a little bit here.
Mm-hmm.
So I want both of you to speculate on this. I'm looking at like a microcosm of a business activity. Okay. Mm-hmm. So a colleague of mine sells these small structures that show up as dwellings on properties, right? They could be laneway suites or secondary dwellings, this kind of thing, factory built sort of thing. Now there's a tremendous need for it because there's a housing shortage, right? This is kind of what's going on. But the very, very frustrating thing is that you can have a 30 ton, 50 ton, 80 ton crane moving 80, 40, 50, 60, 70,000 pounds of finished product.
Mm.
The cost of which in terms of equipment, right, can be the range of about $3, $4 to $10 million. Okay.
Come again? So that's the cost of the machine itself, or the cost of?
Yeah, the cost of like the mobile crane and and all the equipment actually used to do this kind of thing, and it translates in other sectors as well.
Yeah,
pile drivers to do these fancy types of things for yachts and all these kinds of things. So there's like this heavy equipment that costs quite a bit of money, right? Mm. So the point that I want to make is that these guys will, go out into the industry, into the market, and charge, say approximately $500 to $1,000 an hour, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yet, well, I'm going to use one of Steve's words: the bloke downtown is the lawyer's charging $500 an hour, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that just baffles me, right? Where, like, how do we get to a state of valuation where millions of dollars worth of equipment and technology has like a value of nothing in some situations, right? Like it's part of the labor market and rolled up into the labor market. I don't understand that. Like, how do we get there?
It's probably worth getting Blair Fix on here one day, by the way, on that front, because the myth that neoclassical economics perpetuates is that people get paid with what they call their marginal product. So the extra amount of money they contribute to GDP is what they get paid. It's slightly more complicated, but that's the basic idea. So the proposition there is that the marginal product of a lawyer, and the amount that lawyer increases GDP by, is $500 an hour. And the machine, which includes the marginal product of the machinery as well as the worker, is just $1,000 an hour, and that's why the price difference applies. So in that sense, one lawyer is half one moving crane plus labour. That is bollocks, and the person who's done the best to show that it's bollocks using empirical data is Blair Fix. And what he shows is that the amount of money you get paid fundamentally relates to how many people you command. It's a hierarchical thing. So in that sense, a lawyer it isn't the number of necessarily, it's also status in that sense. So a lawyer is going to be hired as a hired gun by a corporation that is defending some enormous lawsuit. And that corporation, the pay of the top executive of that corporation will be will put the lawyer to shame, and they subcontract a bit of the income of the company, effectively to defend their hierarchical income. So it's got everything to do with power and nothing to do with productivity.
Yeah. And that's a real shame. I see a lot of problems moving into a new type of economy. We're moving into a resource restricted economy, and in Canada, I really have to scratch my head as on the West Coast to say, where's all of our production gone? Like we don't have. It seems to me like more and more Canadians are a country of consumers, but I mean that from a purchasing standpoint, right? We issue purchase contracts for ferries that are built in Poland and shipped around the world. Where's our manufacturing sector?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what's happening is corporations relocating production to where they pay lower wages. And that was the driving force between China's industrialization. It actually began well before China did. I was doing studies on the relocation of production back in the 70s. And the main focus we're looking at that stage, I think, was Indonesia, which had a lot of, and the Philippines, which for obvious reasons had a lot of, ease for American corporations to locate there. But what tended to happen was that when you located that plant in a third world country like Indonesia or the Philippines, and the Philippines is a good example, that would drive up the local wages. It wouldn't drive up the wages for the whole country, but the workers getting inside there would get higher wages. And you would have a pressure on the wage cost. And the companies would say, where else can we move to next? Let's move to Vietnam, et cetera, et cetera. They'd shift around. And what was very special about the Chinese is when they came on, of course, their wage levels were lower than you'd get in Indonesia and the Philippines, because the conditions at the end of the Mao period were appallingly bad, particularly after the Great Leap Forward, the catastrophe of the Great Leap Forward and so on. The Chinese, first of all, pretty much guaranteed they'd keep the wages relatively low. They wouldn't let them rise as much as they'd rise under when there's some sort of market effect, as you saw in Indonesia and the Philippines. But secondly, they required American corporations, when they established themselves in a free trade zone like the Shenzhen Free Trade Zone, just north of Hong Kong, they required them to have a Chinese partner. And the Chinese partner, within 5 years, had to own 50% of the business. Now, can you imagine an American capitalist signing up on that deal? The only reason was that the handing over half the ownership of the facility to a Chinese, and normally a member of the Communist Party or a top factory boss at that stage in the state-run system they had. The only way they would do it, the saving they're making on wages was so great that the increase in the money they got from paying American workers less more than compensated for having to share half the profit with the Chinese proto-capitalist. So and now what you've got is, I think China is about, I'm not sure of the exact figures, but it's something like 30% of world manufacturing occurs in China. Now, America still is, an industrial powerhouse, obviously, but it's lost a lot of the capacity to build, industrial products. And Canada and Australia and England are far worse on that front. They've really gone the whole. Australia and Canada did the Let's Go minerals exporting, with a very high-tech economy still behind it, and high-tech mining, of course. Whereas the British went for services, and by services they meant selling people debt. There was a major part of it. So what you've got ultimately is a whole lot of manufacturing sectors in America, but particularly in the satellite Anglo-Saxon states. And you will see some differences there with places like Germany. So Germany never allowed its manufacturers to shift offshore that much. And part of the reason for that is that the German companies have a parallel board called an Aufsichtsrat. I think that's the word, if not the pronunciation, which has worker and community representatives on it. And that board, as well as the main board, has to agree to any policy changes. And the workers weren't about to send their jobs overseas. But quite frequently, American workers would find themselves being sent on a nice little jaunt to the Philippines to go and teach the people there how to do their job and come back and get made redundant. So an enormous change in the power between labour and capital over the last 40 years.
Yeah, well, the way I see it is that there's certain countries that will be in more or less an advantage kind of position when it comes to a new regime or paradigm kind of shift. You know, if that's where we're headed, I think it's inevitable because we're having such a rapid change with the environment. I just think there's no choice. But can we back up a little bit? I wanted to talk about the comparison between the Indonesian economies, where I think you hinted that they had a slight market factor in there, and then also from Mao and the communism comparison. I'm interested in teasing some of that out.
Oh, look, it's the Indonesian thing. Obviously, Indonesia, I think now is a population of over 250 million people, something of that scale. It was smaller, of course, than the 70s, maybe half that size. So I'm not talking a market effect that hit the entire populace, but you had an industrial enclave established around a free trade zone, and then in that free trade zone, you had workers who you are an unskilled worker, but an unskilled worker means you've been trained to use a specific piece of machinery, and so you have a certain amount of skill level compared to like a peasant working in the rice fields and so on. So you got a two-tiered wage system coming out of that to some degree, and therefore, even though there was an enormous unemployed labour mass or people earning close to subsistence incomes in the rural sector, it wasn't easy to make that transfer across. So there would be a bit of a boost to the wages being paid domestically. And, the kickbacks and stuff like that as well in a place like Indonesia under the Suharto regime, and then the Sukarno regime, which is worse. So that sort of thing meant that there was a tendency for the wages to rise around these enclaves. And the frequent thing would be then a shift to another one, which you couldn't stop, because when the corporations went into those enclaves, 100% foreign owned, they were paying. The whole thing was lowering not just lowering the cost of labour, but lowering the cost of capital and regulations as well. So they didn't have the environmental regulations they'd face in America. They didn't have the social protections the workers would face in America, and so on and so forth. And if they wanted to shift shop, they could. They just basically put everything on a set of containers and ship it to another country. What the Chinese did was say, well, you can't do that, because if it's 50% owned by a Chinese partner, first of all, they're not going to be able to do that relocation. And what happened was, and the Chinese were very deliberate about this, they wanted to get the engineering capability of America as fast as possible. So it was a much more nationalistic industrialization scheme, relying upon foreign technology in the first instance, more so than the Japanese did after the Second World War, but doing that in such a way that they got half ownership of the capital, and then they would deconstruct and learn how to build the stuff themselves. And now, of course, a huge amount of that capital equipment is made far more effectively in China than it is in America. I expect that if America wanted to make high-speed rail these days, it would find itself uncompetitive with China.
Right.
And would have to really import the stuff from China, or they'll pay license fees for Chinese technology. That's a huge change over the last 40 years.
Yeah, I do that. Okay, so I have a question about socialism and a purely socialistic a system that's purely socialism. Is it doomed? Is it flawed? Is it possible? We seem to have so many failed attempts. And
yeah. I mean, I think pure capitalism is is actually probably more flawed than pure communism. Okay. It's one extreme or the other, and the typical Western philosophy pushes you into one extreme or the other. the Asian attitude is a bit more yin and yang. So you want to have a balance. You don't just put chili on something, you put chili and sugar, etc., etc. So there's a sense of balance, and that's built into Buddhist philosophy as well. Maybe to some extent Confucian too. So you need a balance between the two. So if you go for the extreme socialist situation, you have no private ownership, and you also have allegedly a society dedicated to raising up the living standards of the poorest of the poor. Okay? And the best person on this is a Hungarian economist called János Kornai, one of the unsung giants of economics, non-orthodox, obviously. And he was a Hungarian, and he wanted to explain why was it that socialism grew more slowly than capitalism. Now, you could argue, it's all Stalin's fault. But he said, well, let's leave Stalin out of the equation. Let's imagine a perfect socialist society where the objective is to increase the income of the poor as fast as possible. So you want to have high incomes for the workers, and you are trying to industrialize. So all these countries began as in a pre-industrialization state. So you want to industrialize, and that means you've got a whole range of industrial sectors you want to provide resources for. Well, if you try to do that, and even if you do it perfectly or close to perfectly, they're all going to have less resources than they actually want. And because you won't do it perfectly, there will be supply constraints everywhere. And then if you're managing one of these firms and you've got numerical targets set for your output levels over time, the easiest way to reach those output targets is not to innovate. Put all your resources to current production. Don't waste any resources innovating. So he said what you would get out of that is a slow rate of growth. You would get very high incomes, but a slow rate of growth, and you would get very little technological development. Whereas on the other hand, he said that you call that a supply-constrained economy. Now, ironically, that is suitable for the mathematics of neoclassical economics. Okay, that's the world they imagine, a supply-constrained world. And what Kornai said, a supply-constrained world will grow more slowly than a demand constraint, which is the capitalist. And then at the other extreme, a pure capitalist economy, you try to screw the workers. Let's get as much profit as possible, and we're all in it for ourselves. We're not for the collective good. There's no national planning and so on. So you have a range of markets: car market, a house market, clothing market, et cetera, and you, as an individual capitalist, want to get as much of that market as possible. So your growth projections for your own firm, when you sum it over all the industry, are going to exceed the growth of the whole industry. So for natural tendency, you have excess capacity. And when you have excess capacity, the best way to make sure you use more of your excess capacity than your competitors manage to do is to innovate. You don't try to undercut them on price necessarily. You undercut them on features. And therefore, you're forever innovating and trying to take excess capacity away from your rivals and get it for yourself instead. And if you're successful, you grow faster individually. And the workers can't necessarily afford everything because their wages are low. So you're going to have booms and slumps and competition over distribution of income and so on. And when there's an employment boom, the workers are going to demand more, and that's going to cut into profit. So you'll get a crash coming out of it as well. So what he said was you'll get a cyclical system, but which innovates. And so it'll be cyclical, but it'll grow faster than the socialist system. Now, I think that's still the most convincing argument as to why socialism relative to capitalism failed. Because I'm going to be long-winded here, pardon me, because I've done, imagine a fair bit of reading on this. If you go back to look at the original Soviet plans, they were based on Marx's reproduction schema. So Marx divided the industry into three sectors, and I haven't prepared for this, so I'm going to be the sector 1, 2, 3. One was like consumer goods, 2 was capitalist goods, 3 is investment, something like that. And what a mathematician called, I've got to think of his name here, Feldman, Feldman, he did a mathematical model using the sector, I think he broke it into two, sector 1 and sector 2, so consumption and investment. And he showed that if you have a high rate of growth of the investment sector than the consumption sector, then initially consumption will be lower than in the West. But because you're putting your effort into producing the means of production, you will ultimately overtake the West. And that was the plan which was swallowed by such Stalin and Lenin before him, and became the basis of the 5-year plans. And this is why Khrushchev did his bang the shoe on the thing at the United Nations back in the 60s, saying, we will bury you. Now, what he meant was, we will bury you in consumer goods. We will produce more output for our workers than you will do. Okay, now the failure in that, I've done the mathematics on this as well in an early paper of mine. The failure on that was that it relied upon an unemployed workforce. This trajectory of increased production required more and more workers. You're building the machinery and you're just assuming you're going to have the workers. And that worked during the early period of the Soviet system, because you did have a large pool of unemployed or lowly employed peasants, et cetera, that you could transfer to the industrial sector. But once you put full employment, your constraint was no longer the lack of machinery, the lack of workers. And you had this rapid increase in growth, and then it leveled off completely. But they continued believing they could produce the means of production faster, and they downplayed the consumer goods. Now that even further reduced the rate of innovation. So what you got was Soviet consumers looking longingly at pairs of American denim jeans in the 50s and 60s, and ultimately, it wasn't the workers of the East who were buried in consumer goods. Relatively speaking, it was those of the West, and the ones of the East wanted to climb over the Berlin Wall to get there.
Wow. Okay, that was really good. What I'm thinking about is innovation, and I know this may sound like this is kind of a stupid question, but how do you have innovation and austerity in a climate change reality realm of economics? Like, how do you do that? How is that even possible?
Well, innovation doesn't just come from the capitalist system; it comes from the government side as well, as we saw in the Second World War. And we saw very early in the 50s and 60s, a huge amount of the innovation which established UK American industry was done in the government sector. Things like DARPA, for example. DARPA is what gave us the internet. Okay, the Defense Advanced Research Program Authority. I think it stands for DARPA, and that's where it was Tim Wenders. I can't think of his last name, but the guy who invented the World Wide Web was working for them and set the World Wide Web up as a means to avoid a breakdown of communications during a nuclear war. Because the idea was, rather than having a single channel by which signals would go from one point to another, you would have a signal which could pass through any pattern, which would get through all the links between one computer and another across the telecommunication system of the planet. And that's why it's called a web. Because if you break a web, there's still a couple of strands that the spider can climb along to get to the other side. So could you imagine capitalism without the web these days? Where did it come from? The government sector. So innovation still occurs. And when you have an existential threat, then what you will get is the government throwing money at engineers saying, please find a way out of this. And I think that's what's going to happen with climate. I hope it's going to happen with climate change, because I think we're hiding to nothing to be in a disastrous situation, courtesy of the French, the fuckwits in the oil industry and their enablers in economics are going to be in a catastrophe at some point. There'll be no market solution. It'll have to be government run, and that'll mean the government hiring the best engineers and physicists and saying, what the hell can we do to try to get the planet back to a stage where there's some possibility of most of us surviving the next 20 years.
Scott seems like he's burning to say something.
Oh,
I can feel it.
That was last week when I was burning to say something, and I was so desirous to ask Stephen a question that I actually had to lay down afterwards. I was so disappointed and nauseous. And I was so prepared to ask all these questions. And now this week I got the second bout of COVID, and my emotional life is in turmoil. So I'm not as prepared as I was this week, but I still remember the core question that I had for Steve. I was so excited. So Daniel, as you may know, Steve Keen's claim to fame is that he's shown that there's an intrinsic use value factor, not only in the commodities, and Marx mentions this in The Good and Rest of Right, in the famous footnote that he read when he was visiting his father-in-law or whatever it was, but also in the machinery. And so there's a value added, there's a surplus that can come from the from constant capital. And this was precluded by Ricardo and Smith and Marx. They wanted to say that the margin only comes from labor, right? That's the only input that produces a surplus. And so for the last 2 weeks, I've just been wondering, what is the end game of this insight? So let's say you convince the world that in fact, there is an intrinsic use value component that can add surplus. So the rate of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall is not necessarily always going down. We've found like except for entropy, we found and so it's not always inexhaustible, but there are pockets of high use value materials, even raw materials that can be integrated into your production scheme, and this itself alone will provide some surplus value. So once this recognition, let's say this becomes canonical, this understanding, and we no longer believe in a pure labor theory of value, what would be the best end result of this?
Well, I mean, of course, it's only Marxists who believe in the labor theory of value at the moment. We've got to convert the neoclassicals. What they both get wrong is the role of energy in all this. And in fact, this turns up in Marx's own writing. I've forgotten whether it's in the Grundrisse or whether it's in Capital 3. I think it's in the Grundrisse. But one stage he has a go at Ricardo. When Ricardo tries to explain the value, the price one can get, because value is effectively priced in the way that Ricardo did his logic. Ricardo was saying that the undeveloped mind is paid for at its value. And Marx, he's typically I think he and I would have got along well. We both got a fairly scatological way of talking about logical conundrums in our rivals. And he said, does Ricardo mean that the price is paid for the labor time that has gone into this mine when no labor time has gone into it? Or does value mean here, as it must do, the prospective use value and therefore hypothetical exchange value of the undeveloped minerals? Now, that is spot on for the role of energy in providing the engine that actually makes human society possible, because there is no surplus. Let's do our matrix moment here. There is no surplus. What we are doing, however, is finding free energy around, okay, and free minerals. We didn't make the minerals. We didn't make the energy. It's just there in nature, and we find concentrations of both, and then we can exploit that. And then we have to use machinery and labor to do it, but they are both enabling that energy to be exploited. Okay, and that puts Marx's use value, exchange value stuff can handle that beautifully. The labor theory of value can't. So that's the end game. You then say, well, it all comes down to this prospective use value. But then the question is, how much exchange value do you have to put in to get that use value out? Now, when we're back in the days of the Beverly Hillbillies, you fire a shotgun at a rabbit and you open up a oil well.
Black gold.
Yeah, black gold, Texas tea. I'm the old bloke here, and you guys know the lines. This is great. But the impact of that is that the exchange value going in is trivial. The use value is huge, and that effectively is what we now call energy return and energy invested, and that applies to minerals. So it's minerals return and energy invested, et cetera, et cetera. But as we exploit more and more of the planet's resources, we have to go. It's no longer firing a gun and a shotgun into the ground of Tennessee. It's going off the coast of the Gulf of Mexico and drilling, putting a floating platform and letting it drill down 1.5 kilometers, a mile through the ocean, and then going 5 miles into the crust to find it, and drilling sideways when you get there. The energy, the exchange value going in is huge. The use value is the same, but you've got a much, much smaller margin between the two. And that's the end game. That's where we are now.
Okay, so this point about the Marx was wrong about Marx, Smith, and Ricardo were wrong that labor is the only input of surplus value. So this issue is more of an academic or factual fact about how capitalism works. Is this something that if it were advertised or something like this, it became canonical, would it change the mode of production in any way? Would it have any consequences?
I think it would have huge consequences, and this is one reason, like I criticize Smith for unintentionally, he didn't understand what he was doing, but unintentionally taking us away from the understanding the physiocrats had, that it was energy which was the source of value, the source of the capacity of human society to live above the level of the beasts. So like the physiocrats, who Cantillon's a beautiful example, see all wealth coming from land. And fundamentally, when you read what they wrote with the perspective of modern understanding of energy, what they're saying is we're getting free energy from the sun, and that is being converted into other forms by labour and machinery. And then that was the correct understanding of what's going on. Because in the case of fossil fuels, the sunlight fell 100 million years ago, but we're still effectively exploiting that energy from the sun. So that is the rich understanding. Now, once you have that, there's a fundamentally physical foundation for economics, and that physical foundation acknowledges the laws of thermodynamics. And one of those, as you mentioned a moment ago, is entropy, the tendency to increasing disorder over time. So all we are doing effectively is accelerating that. We're making it happen more rapidly than it would happen in the absence of human technology. But that therefore means we would know right from the outset we're dumping this into the biosphere. And therefore we're constraining our capacity to survive on this planet. We'd also know that we have with energy, return energy vested as a real thing. We would have been aware of this from 1800 rather than struggling in 2020 to get economists to realise it's today. And so there would have been an acknowledgement that your production affects somebody else's production because you're dumping waste, et cetera, et cetera. We would have an ecologically aware economics. Now, I think that sort of world would never have given us the rapacious go for it capitalism that neoclassical economics gave us, go for growth, et cetera, et cetera. We'd realise there are limits, and we would have realised those limits 150 years ago, certainly 100 years ago. And then at that point, we would have been feasible to have, the intelligent conversations about constraining the damage we do to the biosphere, rather than the bullshit that's gone through the IPCC, where the scientists are doing that all the time, but the politicians and the economists and policy makers and bureaucrats are doing lip service to it and still basically believe in unlimited growth.
Yeah, because we still have the economic models based off the neoclassical, and I'm starting to see it. I was watching a show from Ben Shapiro trying to dismantle, somebody, trying to make it a defense for climate change. And as I'm not sure if everybody knows here that, Ben Shapiro is an Orthodox Jewish man and a conservative, and really downplays what let's just call him a denier. He's not really a denier, but he's
a trivializer.
Yeah, well, actually, you'll notice. Yeah, he'll trivialize it, and he'll realize that the status quo, like Michael Mann says, the business as usual mantra is something that typically out of the conservative platform is, that's valued the most, right? And he's trying to position himself where there's the group on the left are trying to bamboozle, power grab, anything to.
I wish the left was that organized. This is what I find hilarious about the left conspiracy, right-wing views of conspiracies by the left. The left couldn't organize a dinner party. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I don't know. We're in the middle of an election here in Canada, and I mean, it's just been called, and I have to say the Conservatives are very organized, and I think they're splitting the votes. I think our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, he called the election, but one of these things to try and go from a minority government to a majority government. That's what he's wanting to do. But the Conservatives actually have a pretty good game plan. And a couple points. The topic of environment is throughout party lines. It's just what the parties choose to do with them is different. And the choice is now on the tyranny of the majority. And yet you have the scientific body saying, none of those pathways are going to work with prosperity. And that's the frustrating thing. I view myself completely politically homeless because I don't see any leadership here.
No, it won't happen. But you were talking about Shapiro, though. Do you want to make a point about Shapiro, or?
Oh, the Shapiro point was mainly that he's basically, as I was watching him, he tried to bring up. He's like, oh, there's one famous economist, and he says, and he was trying to think of his name, and I was like, Nordhaus. He was referring to Nordhaus because they're basing their projections on this, and you was like, horseshit, right? So it is. It's like the smart business people are trying to say, let's talk to the smartest people that we know in economics, and here's the projected outcomes. So of course the left looks ridiculous. Of course the doomsdayers look ridiculous, right? And that's the problem. And I think that's the gift you've given me, Steve, is that I'm kind of looking at some of these. I'm looking at government policy. I'm looking at the likes of these people on the other side of the left-right divide, and I can see that they're basing this off of that neoclassical model, in particular somebody like Nordhaus. Like, he's one of the boys, but so it's not a denial at this point, right? The denial, at least from like an intellectual elite on the right or the conservative side, the Republicans are basically going to say, y'all don't know how to really run business, right?
Yeah, they are. And your point, by the way, about how Nordhaus and friends are used as the basis of trivializing, not necessarily denying climate change, but trivializing climate change. I'll be making that point myself very heavily. And there's a new paper by, he's actually a Ph.D. student right now, but he's done extremely well in getting published, a guy called Ben Franta. And Ben has taken a look at the influence of the oil lobby, but how that's been enabled by economic consultants. He's got a particular firm that he's targeted, but for all of them are using the sort of projection that Nordhaus makes. And because they're not necessarily using Nordhaus's projection, but because their projections are very similar to Nordhaus's, they've got the imprimatur of economic science on their side, and therefore saying, we don't need to worry about this, it's trivial, And like the economists saying, oh, it's really serious. It's going to cost you 10% of GDP in 100 years. And that'll be 10% of GDP that's 10 times as high as it is now. So effectively, in today's terms, it's 1% of GDP. But that really matters to you, doesn't it? And they think they're making a case for carbon tax. The business community and the politicians who swallow this stuff think, 10% of 10 times more than we've got now in 100 years? Okay, what do I have to go and say and shut up the green lobby out there and make it look like I care about this stuff? Yeah. And of course, what's actually happening, it's total bullshit. And at some point, things like the Hurricane Ida on one side of the country and devastating bushfires on the other will meet in the middle and burn Washington burn Washington one day and flood it the next. And they go, holy shit, nobody warned us about this. And the reason is, well, you swallowed this garbage from neoclassical economists and the oil lobby, didn't you? And they're working hand in glove. Yeah. And your example last week was really really hard hitting because I repeated it probably half a dozen times to friends and family. But the idea that the Netherlands would be completely wiped out because of AMOC, I think it was. It's a possibility. I mean, they don't say it's going to happen, not a prediction, okay? But the basic story is, if you have storms of the scale that Hansen and co were talking about in a paper in 2016, where they were saying 2 degrees is extremely dangerous. That's actually part of the title of the paper. They said you got storms which would generate waves that had to be of the order of 60 to 80 feet high. Okay. Now, I haven't actually been out to check the dikes in Amsterdam. I wanted to go there, but I didn't have a car to drive. Then the riding was a bit far, so I never quite read out and took a look at it. It's a very impressive piece of engineering, but I don't think it could handle an 80-foot wave. And if you actually had that sort of thing happening, then quite potentially everything we've built and even stuff we're projected to build for the future is projected for like a increase from a 1 in 100 year to a 1 in 1,000 year flood and storm and stuff like this. This would be 1 in 100,000 years, 1 in a million year type storms, and they could regularly occur. So our infrastructure could be overwhelmed before we're aware of it. Then once it is overwhelmed, well, you're not going to rebuild it. I believe that it's called New Orleans is still a wreck, relatively a wreck, 16 years after Katrina, and now it had Ida coming along nearby shortly after. We don't repair that infrastructure, and what would you need as a sort of set of dikes to be able to handle storms which were 60 to 80 feet high? You'd also have, and this is the fun bit, if the AMOC does disappear, you'll get a rapid increase in the height of the ocean around on the east coast of America. So these sorts of effects are completely trivialized by the economists. I'm just doing it. I'm working on a new paper now, critiquing a new paper which came out just recently by a guy called Dietz, Simon Dietz, and then also Gurno Wagner. And I think, I can't believe this shit. This is a paper that allegedly takes into account tipping points. Mm-hmm. And they have 8 tipping points they considered in this paper, including shutdown of AMOC, which, by the way, they said was going to be beneficial.
Oh, yeah, you mentioned that last time.
Yeah, but I had a look at it. Where do they get their numbers from? Now, they have what they call, part of their mathematics is what they call willingness to pay. You're willing to pay a certain percentage of GDP to avoid a certain level of temperature increase. And they said that people's desire to avoid temperature X would be so many percent of GDP. And there's some point at which that percentage of GDP is 100%, okay? Yeah, all of GDP, you're willing to devote all of that to avoiding this temperature. Have a guess what the temperature was?
200 degrees.
Not far wrong. 17.68 degrees Celsius. About 32 degrees hotter on average than today. And that's what they say is catastrophic. Now, how did they derive that number? They assumed, quote unquote, damages from climate change were quadratic.
Right.
This is in a paper on tipping points. Now, the whole idea of tipping points is there's a rapid change in the rate of change at some point when you go past a tipping point temperature. There is no such thing in a quadratic, okay? And yet they assume that damages are quadratic. And then they come up with the result that the impact of a 6-degree increase in temperature, which triggers all these 8 tipping points, compared to a 6-degree increase in temperature, which does not trigger any of these tipping points, which itself is a crazy concept, will be 1.4% of GDP.
Why doesn't someone found a watchdog institute for economists that says, we hold truth to be high value, and if you join our organization, you'll get a little insignia on your papers that says that you're not a pro-lying or like, I'm more cynical. I say that these people are just doing it because they want to get hired. You're saying they're doing it because they want to get hired, but also it's actually accepted inside their peer group, so their peers really believe these models, and it's not just they're trying to please the masters that are paying them.
Yeah, no,
but certainly, I mean, there's some marketing power to terms like true, virtuous, accurate, honest. And so, I mean, could there not be an organization that calls out liars? Could they not have airtime on CNN and say, by the way, if you're interested, they're lying? I mean, people like to hear about that. People like exposés. It's a genre of entertainment. So, I mean, I don't see why.
I'd be happy to have somebody set that up. I mean, the thing is, all these things cost money. And guess what? One thing you don't get as a non-orthodox economist, it's money. Like I finished my academic career. I began it in 1987 and I finished it in 2017 or 2018. And in that period of time, I got precisely 0 government grants. Okay. And I wasted 1.5 years getting 0. My holidays, my summer holidays for 9 years, I spent writing research grants. I find that this is a waste of fucking time, because even the time that I was the highest ranked person at my university and I knew the point score and I was told all 7 of us would get the grant, when it came to the actual giving of the grant, 6 of them got the grant, the 6 with lower point scores than me. And I was knocked down by the economists on the Australian Research Council. They revised my score from 89.75, I think it was, to 76. Okay. So I don't get any money. And all my colleagues and a lot of people like Louis-Philippe Rochon, who's a neighbour of yours, Daniel, he's in Toronto, worked at the University of Laurentian. No money, get some funding from some various sources, but we're living on the smell of an oily rag compared to what the neoclassicals get. So there is that money side of it. If you spout this stuff, your ambition is to get a chair at Yale or at Harvard or Princeton, and you'll get it if you're good at spouting this shit. And it's a reinforcement of your peer group that means you continue believing spouting this shit as being an intellectual, so they'll continue doing it. So the truth, I'd need to get serious funding from a serious company to set that up, and then, maybe one of these days, but it's 50 years later than it should have been.
Well, it seems like a position that you're perfect for, because you have, for me, it's like I see it cinematically, like these people disrespected you when you were young. So you have like the mad scientists, you have a burning desire to show them that they're wrong. So you have the motivation and you have the skills. So you'd be perfect as the head of like the lead researcher at some watchdog institute. I mean, it seems like the perfect position for you. And then I just need to raise the money for it. And I'm not going to get it out of the university sector. I've left the university sector, obviously. I'm getting some of it out of Patreon, but only enough for myself. So one thing I'm trying to do is produce a commercial piece of software, sell that, and finance this my own way. The Elon Musk approach. Right. But in general, you'll never get this sort of stuff. And what you get is, rather than a watchdog institute, you get the so-called Nobel Prize Committee for economics, and there's far more money goes to the positive amplifying feedback to amplify this stuff within the mainstream. And what I'm having a fight with. I've stopped having the fight because I don't want to telegraph my punches any further with Gunnar Wagner on Twitter. But he's outraged that I'm criticising. He said, "What would you do instead?" I haven't yet said my answer would be, I'd do what you guys sank 50 years ago, which is the limits to growth. System dynamic. Look at all these feedbacks. That's what I'd do. You guys trivialized it, destroyed it, and the guy who developed it, one of the 2 surviving members, and the other one's still working, has got 1 laptop and 1 research assistant part-time, and that's it. You guys have got, the amount of money that goes into the research funding of these neoclassicals, I'm getting an inkling of it again. We're looking at this particular research paper and some of the numbers it's based off. They've got hordes of PhD students and grad dips and postdocs and so on, putting together this pretend data of theirs. And, over here I'm on the smell of an oily rag, pointing out that pretend data is pretend data.
Yeah, so we need some funding. Your point on ratifying the Nobel is interesting. The fact that it seems like a more of a positive reinforcement mechanism. So imagine the situation where you're perhaps it's even your paper that eventually does that, Steve. A paradigm shift. Kind of extrapolate there. Say you were tied into the. We joked about this before, that you'd be the last recipient of the Nobel, or you ratify it, and then the award goes to people who are doing like the good economics, not the bad economics. So that's a possibility as opposed to a watchdog organization, right?
Really. Not when the Swedish central bank are the ones who decide who gets the Nobel.
Okay.
See, the Swedish central bank set the Nobel up in 1969 as part of a political argument for neoliberalism in Sweden. They wanted to legitimize, strengthen the neoliberal case that they were making because they're neoclassical economists. So they proposed to the Nobel Committee that they would establish the Svegs Riksbank Prize in Economics in honor of Alfred Nobel. Talk about a piece and they'd pay the money for it. So the 1.4 million krona, which is, I think it was about $1 million US roughly at the time the prize was worth. That was paid by the Swedish central bank. Now they've got a committee system behind it because it's basically you've got to be a head of department or head of school in a mainstream economics university, maybe at a moderately to highly ranked university, to be able to suggest he might get the recipient of the Nobel Prize. I'm not holding my breath, mate.
No. Okay. Well, yeah. Well, anyways, any like news on the submittal from?
Oh, just no, still waiting. It's before referees at the moment, so we're waiting on that. But in the meantime, we're writing a letter in reply to this paper by Dietz and Wagner and friends about tipping points, because what I can see happening, and this is one of the travesties of neoclassical economics. They can say, when they've got somebody's done a paper which allegedly includes tipping points, and you criticise them for not handling tipping points, they say, oh, that's been covered in Dietz and 2021. That's your next problem. I say, well, the next problem is Dietz and Friends 2021. Have you read the fucking thing? And when you read it, I mean, again, you've got to be living in a bubble to believe this stuff. It's the whole idea. You know, if you're in a Catholic church and you start talking about the Eucharist and the Holy Spirit, et cetera, nobody's going to laugh in the audience. But if you did the same thing, and if you came in and it was a Buddhist and you start talking about reincarnation, they'll laugh in that audience. Okay, so in their own audience, they're happy to use, let's assume a resurrection as part of the argument, and that's what goes on. So in the case of this Dietz paper, and I've been digging. I always dig. I go backwards as far as I can to find where does this actual idea came from. So in the middle of it, there's a key equation for non-market damages. And this equation, first of all, has this 17.68 Celsius degree increase as being the point at which the entire economy is destroyed. And how did you work it? Well, they used a quadratic. They assumed quadratic damages. And of course, you've got zero damages at 0 degrees. And it's also, the slope is 0 at that point. They fitted it through 2.5 degrees Celsius increase for 2% damages. And once you've done that, it'll hit 100% at 17.68. That's where the prediction came from, And I think, you've got to be fucking kidding. I mean, no serious science paper even wishes to contemplate anything over, pretty much 4 degrees, because I think at that stage it's going to be a catastrophe. 6 degrees is anything, listen, you shut up, you're mad. 10, get out of here. 17.68 degrees.
Yeah.
And it's just because they assumed a quadratic. Now, what I've done for fun as part of the paper, I've assumed an exponential. And I fit that exponential so it goes through 0 at very, very close to 0 slope, goes through 2.5 and 2%. And then at 4%, at 4 degrees, it hits 100% destruction of GDP. And that's a bit closer to what scientists think. Okay, so justify your assumption of a quadratic over an assumption of an exponential. And they can't.
Oh, yeah, nice setup. Yeah, that's a good setup. Yeah.
But they're also assuming that people will be comfortable with the Mad Max cannibalism type future, where we're living in caves underground. And there's just a few people, like in the second Planet of the Apes movie, where they're worshiping a nuclear missile in underneath the ground in some cave. I mean, that's a feasible future. There's still survival happening. So
they don't think that, unfortunately. I mean, I wish they did, because at least I could say they're realistic about what they're bringing the humanity towards. But they seriously believe we'll all be flying private jets in 100 years' time. If you read that wanker Bjorn Lomborg, he says, climate change is a serious problem, but it's not as serious as many, many others, and we should leave it for people to handle it in the future when we're all much wealthier. Okay. Now, when you look, again, they even assume an exogenous rate of economic growth in this paper. Okay? They take it from, there's the RCP, the different carbon paths that were worked out by the IPCC. They've done their own SPC, social paths, and that gives you a set of assumed rates of economic growth over time, and they feed that exogenous set of assumptions into this model. So they've got economic growth going on exogenously while the temperature is hitting 15 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. They don't have feedback from their economic, from the temperature level to their GDP, and you think the only way you can get away with this is because we all assume that Christ is risen. It's religious, and it's a religious community where if you say what everybody else already has as a fundamental belief, nobody's going to object to it. Now, if there's a Buddhist in the room, he's going to say, sorry? What's this about a human, a God coming down to earth, etc., and virgin birth, and etc., etc.? So they're in a bubble, and the bubble is called neoclassical economics. And the belief systems of that enable them to get away with making an assumption like damages are quadratic without anybody saying, you can't do that. But they do.
So is it really, I mean, it's closer to an exponential, but is it an exponential in your?
Oh, that's I mean, if I was going to choose the simplest function that fits what we fear about tipping points, it would be an exponential, for the simple reason that what you get with a tipping point is a change in the rate of change. Okay. Now, an exponential, the differential of an exponential is an exponential. Okay. So effectively, every point on an exponential is a tipping point. Okay. An acceleration in the rate of change. So if you want to do a single function, yes, an exponential is the one to use. And the reason they don't use an exponential, frankly, is because a lot of the time they want to equate marginal cost and marginal revenue, or marginal cost and price in their usual mathematical logic. And the differential of a quadratic is a linear equation, and it makes solving that equality much easier. It's just for mathematical convenience they've chosen quadratics. And so this disease of thinking in terms of quadratic this and quadratic that, they've applied it to climate change as well, without realizing how inherently stupid that is.
Yeah. Scott, one final question. We're right at the top of the hour. Do you have one, final comment, thought, or?
Well, I guess I was fishing here for a particular kind of answer from Steve about this tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Because I listened to another interview when he was talking about it, and it sounded like he was saying, because you don't have this automatic mechanism to produce crisis, the revolution isn't going to come as easy as you thought it would be, orthodox Marxists. In fact, there's this side thing over here, the use value of the machinery and the use value of natural resources, that's providing an input that will prevent the crises, that will prevent the revolution. And I thought, is that the only upshot of this discovery? It sounded like you were saying, here's some information that will allow us to preserve capitalism, but I don't agree with capitalism fully. I think that we should ameliorate the bad parts of capitalism. But basically, you were saying capitalism lacks this flaw, and it's not going to self-destruct as easily as we thought it would. In fact, we ought to preserve it, but preserve it in like a Nordic socialist, healthy kind of way. And I guess it was a double question like that.
Yeah. I mean, So partially, because you don't have because the tendency of the rate of profit to fall is a myth. Then that mechanism to bring about socialism doesn't exist, because the fundamental idea was because labour was the source of surplus, and Marx assumed quite accurately an increase in the ratio of what he called fixed capital to variable capital over time as part of technological development. Therefore, with profit only coming from labour, and you're dividing it by a larger mass of the sum of variable plus fixed capital, you get a tendency for the rate of profit to fall. And that would therefore mean that if that was a real phenomenon that actually hit home, then capitalists would find their rate of profit falling, and their response would be to batten down on the working class and increase working hours, reduce wages.
Those six counter tendencies.
Yeah. But the counter tendencies were, he's being as realistic as he could within that particular framework, and many of those could go on. But if the fundamental cause wasn't there, then you don't even need the counteracting tendencies. So what you get is, in the absence of climate change, in the absence of what we're doing to the biosphere, there'll be no tendency over time for the rate of profit to go in any particular direction at all. And in fact, the main thing that matters was more money going to rentiers. And this is, well, if you look at Ricardo in particular, a major part of Ricardo's attitude was to stop money going to the landlords and make it go to capitalists instead, because he saw them as investing and therefore maintaining the rate of growth of the economy for longer. So the real target for Ricardo was rentiers, not capitalists. And I think on that front, Ricardo was right. It's the rentiers who matter. If you gave it to the capitalists, and again, Marx talks about this in the Communist Manifesto, that the vitality with which they transform the means of production. That was the major thing Marx saw in favor of the capitalist class. So you would want to get more of the money out of the hand of landlords who would just be wasting it on carriages, which was the term that Ricardo used, and also Kane, and get it to the capitalists who'd invest and make factories. And you get more technological development, more growth over time. And Marx even, like in I think it's chapter 17 of volume 1 of Capital, when he brings up his cyclical theory of the economy that Goodwin later formalized, in that chapter, it might be chapter 25, in that chapter, Marx talks about the booms and slumps leading up to wages getting back to whether their wages were above, below, or the same as they were beforehand. So he saw the cycle could lead to increasing wages over time as well, hypothetically. So you would have a cyclical critique of capitalism, not a fundamental collapse critique of capitalism, which is what came out of the labor theory of value.
Okay. And in your view, do you think, given what we know about history, that the best possible mode of production would be something like Nordic capitalism, aka socialism?
That's why I said the yin and the yang. You need a balance of the two. So you have to have a state, and this is where modern monetary theory matters as well. One of the roles of the state is to create money, and that enables commerce in a capitalist economy. And the state also can undertake long-term investments that don't have to make a rate of profit, but are essential for other factors to have a rate of profit. So things like your water system, your sewage system. You don't want to have a sewage system where the individual person has to pay for their toilet, because if you do, you're going to have cholera outbreaks in the poor parts of the world. So there's some things which you simply do not want them to be determined by people's capacity to pay. And
yeah, it's a shame that we have to bring this up, but in America, the whole idea is it's a fantasy that if you could just privatize everything, the whole world would be so much better off and so much more efficient. And there's this hatred. It's like an in principle, superstitious, religious hatred for state planning, just period. Yeah. Just this idea of planning, it's supposed to be offensive.
But that's where, like, a lot of the lobby groups have managed to create that way of thinking, because that wasn't the case back in the 50s and 60s. If that had been the case in the 50s and 60s, then Kennedy would never have said, ask not what the nation can do for you, but what you can do for the nation. That would never have happened. We would never have had the moonshots. So the ideologies have been shifted by 40 or 50 years of neoliberal propaganda, and it's all based on neoclassical economics.
Well put.
Well put. Thanks, Steve.
Okay. See you guys next week.
Okay. Bye.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.